prison wall, I heard a young girl calling, Michael, they are taking you away, for you stole Trevelyan's corn, so the young might see them more. Now a prison ship lies waiting in the bay. Low lie the fields of earth and rye, where once we watched the small free birds fly. Our love was on the wing, we had dreams and songs to sing. It's so lonely round the fields of Athenry.
Who is Trevelyan, and why did Michael steal his corn? This is Charles Trevelyan, showing his Freemason hidden hand. He was appointed as Assistant Secretary to Her Majesty's Treasury to administer food relief to millions of starving Irish Catholics in Ireland 1845-50. Trevelyan limited government aid on the basis that the judgment of God sent the calamity to teach the Irish a lesson. Trevelyan's letter to Chief Poor Law Commissioner in Ireland: we must not complain of what we really want to obtain. If small farmers go and their landlords are reduced to sell portions of their estates to persons who will invest capital, we shall at last arrive at something like a satisfactory settlement. Trevelyan to the Chancellor of the Exchequer: the famine was an effective mechanism for reducing surplus population and was the judgment of God. The real evil with which we have to contend is not the physical evil of the famine, but the moral evil of the selfish, perverse, turbulent character of the people. Don't be fooled by Trevelyan's blame afforded to God's will. Freemasons believe in a supreme being, but of a mystical knowledge. Their Bible features ancient Egyptian gods. It's not a religion, but a secret fraternity. In part 1, we learnt from Arthur Young how Ireland was most established and productive in farming by 1776. In part 2, I present the food wealth of Ireland leading up to the Great Starvation in 1845. In 1824, the Ordnance Survey Office commissioned a military survey of Ireland to produce mapping for land valuation and tax purposes. Ireland was the first country in the world to be accurately mapped at a scale of 6 inches to 1 mile. This mapping provides an excellent graphic account of land utilisation and ownership, housing, schools and transport infrastructure. In alignment with Arthur Young's observations and national census records, we see evidence of industrial-scale agriculture, both livestock and arable farming. I have extracted and categorised the detail from the 1829 and 1842 Ordnance Survey maps over 2 defined areas with opposing terrain and fortunes, one being Clonmel to Cashel, Tipperary, as described by Arthur Young, and the other Belmullet region of Mayo, described by Trevelyan as the darkest corner of Ireland. Clonmel to Cashel, Tipperary. Ancient waterway, the River Suir, offers heavy haulage of grain and livestock to Atlantic ports for export to England and the British Empire, good road connections to all towns and villages. By 1842, the Iron Horse had arrived in Tipperary, now providing fast railway haulage to Dublin, Rosslare and Cork seaports. We can now examine local industry and employment within this study area. With excellent soil fertility, much tillage was given to grain crops. 10 coal mills built by running rivers, 10 creameries for dairy processing of milk, butter and cheese, 16 smithies for making and repairing of all metal farm tools and machines, horseshoes and branding irons. While on holiday in Ireland a few years ago, I was very honoured to be invited into an old smithy closed to the public. The oldly retired blacksmith was third generation. Branding irons for sheep were tested on the door. The 1841 census shows that there were 21,473 British Army soldiers resident in all Ireland, 750 stationed in care barracks. The RIC were armed British Army veterans. All exported food taken from Ireland under British Armed Guard. The Irish Catholic tenants could not afford to buy this food made from their own labour. During the Great Starvation, half the British Army regiments were based in Ireland. Here we see 48 absentee English landlord estates and Church of Ireland or Protestant glebes. Many had lavish landscape gardens, but the houses were largely vacant. This map shows 3 adjacent English landlord estates near Cashel. They're not tilled, just vanity projects. 18 schools. Education stats. Population that could read and write, 15,421. Those that could read, 7,400. And illiterate, 20,016. Within this area, there are 3 baronies and 27 parishes, 28 church ruins. Cromwell's legacy to destroy the Catholic faith. 18 castle ruins, every invader's legacy to destroy Irish culture. The Lewis Topographical Survey, 1837. Belmullet was established by the headquarters of the Coast Guard in 1822, built 117 houses and a penny post service. By 1835, Erris was producing 1,800 tons of oats and barley annually. Several warehouses built for the deposit of corn. Binghamstown Fishery Board erected a landing pier for considerable quantities of corn and potatoes to Westport. Bangor holds fairs monthly for cattle, sheep, pigs and yarn. Kilcommon has frequent violent storms that destroy the potato crop, so the ridges are north to south, raised 2 feet high on the western side. The peasantry subsist chiefly on sea fish and shellfish. 20 hookers of 6 tons each and 100 yawls are employed off the coast. The principal seat is Bingham Castle, residence of Major Bingham. Can you recall where we heard of Bingham in earlier history? Kilcommon has 14 private schools. Educated is 450. Erris Parish is rich in minerals. The 1829 to 1842 Ordnance Survey maps record a whaling station, 2 fish curing stations, fishing station school, 5 Coast Guard stations, 4 coal mills, 4 corn kilns, presumably fired by local turf, and 5 post offices. Given the profile of the fishing industry just for a small part of the Mayo coast, let us add to this the catch from all Ireland. Why is the Irish fisheries catch and value not detailed in the 1841 census? The starving Irish were denied this food. Where did it go? Who profited? Was it taxed? 1841 census for all Ireland shows 9,211 fishermen, excluding farmers fishing as secondary occupation. Note that only 1 person is given as a boat builder. This is false record, as Ireland is famous for its curragh and built its own mackerel yawls and hookers. The Vikings settled in Ireland and gave its great knowledge to the natives. The Irish population had grown to 8.1 million. The British imposed tithe farming made it impossible for the tenant Irish Catholics To maintain self-sufficiency, this scenario created the foundation for a pending human disaster when blight hit the potato crop. I do appreciate few people have the mind for statistics, however they are revealing as to the inherent value of Ireland to the British government. The 1841 census was a register of assets, and the 1851 census was a register of value, stock taking after the colour of its native people. Data to manage productivity, profits and taxes. Please pause to study. Trevelyan. In 1845, the wheat crop was a full average. Oats and barley were abundant, and of turnips, carrots and green crops, including a plentiful hay harvest. There was more than sufficient supply. 1847, the crops of wheat, barley and oats in almost every part of the UK and neighbouring countries this year were magnificent. The smallholders in the barony of Erris, Mayo, declined at first to accept the seed which was offered to them, saying that if they sowed it, the crops would be seized by their landlords. This was not believed at the time in England, but it has nevertheless turned out to be perfectly true. This barony, of which Belmullet is the principal place, is the darkest corner of Ireland. In some instances, broken landowners and their families were receiving rations while their tenants were starving. Meanwhile, great exertions were made to protect the provision trade, and the troops and constabulary were harassed by continual escorts. Convoys under military protection proceeded at state intervals from place to place, without which nothing in the shape of food could be sent with safety. The English Parliament made relief dependent on public works, begrudging starving people something for nothing. It forced weak men to build roads to nowhere. The Board of Works became a colossal organisation of 12,000 subordinate officers. The misappropriation of labour caused the neglect of tillage and cultivation. Labour on public works reached 734,000. This hideous system was inevitably brought to an end. Please listen to this next statement by Trevelyan very carefully, because it undermines the population of Ireland given in the 1841 census. The plan of dividing and subdividing for the purpose of making freeholders was carried to a great extent after 1792, when the elective franchise was restored to the Roman Catholics. The smallholding and potato system offered the inducement of large rents obtained at the smallest possible amount of cost and trouble. The embarrassed and improvident landlord and the leaseholder, whose only object it was to make the most of his short tenure, equally found their account in this state of things, and the result in both cases was that the farms were covered with hovels and miserable cottagers, in order, through them, to create profit rents. When the failure of the potato forced all the squatters and mock tenants into notice, the owner of many a neglected estate was surprised by the apparition of hundreds of miserable beings who had grown up on his property without his knowledge, and now claimed the means of support at his hands. The subsistence of the tenant was at the minimum, the rent was at the maximum, and the interval between the ignorant, excitable peasantry and the proprietor-in-chief was filled only by the middleman, whose business it was to extract rents and not to employ labourers. You have just heard evidence that there was an entire underclass who were completely invisible to the state. The census enumerators, handing out forms prior to the census data collection, did not stray off the boreen, follow barefoot tracks to uncover hundreds of smoking hovels. If not vulnerable to attack, would he issue forms to illiterate people? These Irish people's lives and deaths were unrecorded by design. The British government has betrayed their intention to eradicate the natives by starvation. The population of Ireland was far greater than the official figures published in the 1841 census. Charles Trevelyan restricted the import of corn relief, which could only serve the few who could afford it. Its price was artificially inflated so not to harm the profits of the English landlords, 80 of whom were members of the English Parliament voting against relief in favour of their own financial interests. In 1845, Royal Navy Coast Guard officer Captain Robert Mann was sent to Clare to report on events. He writes, "Not to point out errors, but wish they may be corrected, the poor law I look upon as an indirect absentee tax, drawing on those who did not contribute. It assures the poor man that from the land he must have support. What he labours on will sustain him when he can no longer toil. Until lately, what was the condition of the peasant? Work as he would, till and rear what he could, he might never hope to benefit. His portion was the potato, shared with the pig. Let misfortune come on him, render him unable to work, and he had no claim on the land. The charity I have seen has been from the poor to the poor. Is it any wonder they become spiritless, idle, and even worse?" A townland near here, owned by a landlord who resides constantly away, is let to a middleman at 10 shillings an acre. That middleman resides away also. He relets it to a person in Cork. It is sublet again until the price is £1 10 per annum. Can that place be otherwise than full of distress? A great deal has been written, and many account given of the dreadful sufferings endured by the poor, but the reality in most cases far exceed the description. I frequently look back on it as a fearful and horrid dream. There are but very few who will not gratefully remember the generous and prompt relief afforded in this time of trouble. Such sufferings and such help cannot be easily forgotten. Irish Coast Guard Inspector General Sir James Dombrain, on receiving reports from his Coast Guard officers that people were dying from starvation in remote coastal districts, ordered his officers to issue Prime Minister Peel's imported Indian corn free to starving families. Corn was stored in depots under guard. Dombrain was publicly rebuked by Trevelyan in London, who instructed that the food should be sold through local relief committees or issued in lieu of wages on public relief schemes. Dombrain responded, "There was no one within many miles who could have contributed 1 shilling. The people were actually dying." The Coast Guards were involved in the distribution of food and clothing during the Great Starvation. Relief funds were funded mainly by donations from the Irish diaspora in the United States, Canada and Australia. The government in London denied that there was any crisis and only offered meagre grants and loans. Coast Guard officers raised £429, equivalent to £50,387 today, giving relief in the neighbourhood of their respective stations. Parliament legislated to place the financial onus for famine relief on the Irish landowners, who in turn tried to save money by ejecting tenants from their land. The Irish Catholic population, relying on potatoes for their food, were facing severe starvation within a year. The cruel English landlords offered them no relief or access to food they produced. Families were evicted from their tied cabin if they were too weak to work, so could not pay their rent. They surrendered to the workhouse or died in the ditch. As resistance increased to food being exported throughout the starvation, the British Army was assigned to Ireland to protect the business rights of the English landlords. The greatest injustice to the native Irish Catholics is for this event in history to be called the Irish Potato Famine. There was no famine. There was no shortage of food, the definition of famine. Always correct people who need educating on this fact. The following slides list kind contributors to the relief fund across the world. Mr. Rothschild and Queen Victoria gave pocket change just to be on a list. The charity of modest people is overwhelming. Thank you. The starving Irish victims of British imperialism was well known in America. James Redpath published a response. Not a single dollar should be sent from America to the Lord Mayor of Dublin in response to this appeal. America has given more than all mankind to relieve the distress of the Irish tenantry, a distress created, for the most part, by the exactions of the Irish landlords. Yet instead of appealing to these rich landed proprietors to have pity on the victims of their avarice and holding them up to the scorn of Christendom, if they refuse assistance, the Lord Mayor of Dublin uses the Atlantic cable as a beggarman's dog to catch a few more pennies for the paupers whom these merciless and mercenary miscreants have created. After a lecture in Boston, a seamstress contributed $50 to relieve the Irish distress. This represents 6 months' toil. The Lord Mayor of Dublin gave £50, but spent £700 for the ball to procure a knighthood. The husband of the Duchess of Marlborough received $100,000 as salary for the office of Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. He inherited enormous wealth of the Churchills. The Duchess gave £250 to the fund. The Lord Mayor has become a persistent beggar from America. Pass the hat again to your penurious Queen, Mr. Mayor, and your merciless landlords, and your close-fisted gentry before you shout across the Atlantic to us. What newspaper do you think Trevelyan and his kind read in London? Let's hear what the Times said in March 1847. The astounding apathy of the Irish themselves to the most horrible scenes under their eyes and capable of relief by the smallest exertion is something absolutely without parallel in the history of civilized nations. Could anything make it clearer that it is not money, but men that Ireland wants, real men, possessed of average hearts, heads and hands? When or how did the English idle rich qualify to lecture the Irish on work ethic and industry? This slide details the annual diary of a West Country farmer. Although the images are from the 1900s, they are representative of the starvation years. Agriculture is a reserve of rural people with no other opportunities. Knowledge is passed down from father to son. A more responsible report from the Illustrated London News, October 1846. The accounts of the state of Ireland grow darker and darker. Famine seems to be doing its worst, and the extreme of want is producing revolt and riot. At Dungarvan, it appears that the military have been obliged to fire on people with fatal effect. This is one of the horrors attending on scarcity. The rebellion it incites is of the worst kind. The aggressors find a certain amount of sympathy and excuse, which, although against our judgment, it is impossible to withhold. The mass makes a wild and desperate attempt to snatch a remedy at all risks, with this sad and heart-rending result. The Sligo Champion, January 1847. Thomas Burrows, medical doctor, examined the body of Thomas McManus. Both of the legs, as far as the buttocks, appeared to have been eaten off by a pig. Those who saw the body were of the opinion, from the agonised expression of McManus's countenance, that he was alive when the pig attacked him. I believe it's very important to connect with individual people in history, so I submit two sad details. In 2016, Bradford and Durham University scientists collected teeth from starvation bodies in a Kilkenny Union Workhouse cemetery for analysis of the stable isotopes and nitrogen and carbon in human teeth to establish markers for starvation. Evidence of body tissue breaking down and being recycled as the starving human literally consumed itself. The body was eating itself. Evidence showed in some teeth persons survived earlier famines. When the potato crop was good, the evidence is that the people's diet was remarkably good. Emigration to Quebec, Canada in 1847. Across 26 ships, 6,110 Irish had landlord-assisted passage. Among the emigrants who arrived in Grosse Île, dead from typhus on board coffin ships and without relatives, were Mary Clark, possessing £100 and 8 gold rings, and sadly Andrew Shannon, possessing 2.5 pence. It must be understood that there were merciless Irishmen who sought to profit out of the abject misery of their fellow native Irish, recruited land grabbers, secured the land surrendered by starving families. Charles Trevelyan turned his attention to clearing Scottish Islands and Highlands of Celts after his inhumane legacy left in Ireland. These people were more fortunate in receiving assisted passage to Australia. Trevelyan planned to settle Germans in their place. He stated, "Germans are less foreign to us than the Irish or Scotch Celt." Trevelyan was knighted in 1848 in recognition of his services during the removal of food by British armed forces. The Irish Catholics who survived the starvation fought on for land rights and boycott unpopular landlords. By 1881, Irish Land Acts gave them the rights of land ownership. The census of 1851 reveals a statement that highlights the impact of deaths and emigration on the productivity and economy of Ireland. Chief Commissioner Registrar General appointed by the Earl of Clarendon. The emigration of 1851 nearly doubled the estimated average of the preceding 10 years, exceeded any probable increase of the population by nearly 4 to 1. The classes that emigrate include a large proportion of the youngest and strongest and most healthiest and energetic of the population. Those who remain including an unusual proportion of the old, most feeble and destitute, do not replace by births losses by deaths. Unless the emigration be soon arrested, the country will be deserted by its original population. All those obstacles which in ordinary cases would be opposed to so wholesome an emigration appeared in the case of the Irish to be smoothed away. The misery which they have many years endured has destroyed their attachment to their native soil. 1886, the Plan of Campaign, was a stratagem adopted in Ireland between 1886 and 1891, coordinated by Irish politicians for the benefit of tenant farmers against mainly absentee and rack-rent landlords. It was launched to counter agricultural distress caused by the continual depression in prices of dairy products and cattle from the mid-1870s, which left many tenants in arrears with rent. Bad weather in 1885 and 1886 also caused crop failure, making it harder to pay rents. The land war of the early 1880s was about to be renewed after evictions increased and outrages became widespread. 1914 saw nationalist and unionist private militia groups form after 3 years of Parliament delay in delivering Home Rule. Irish Volunteers for Home Rule and the Ulster Volunteer Force against Home Rule. As World War I broke out in 1914, many Irish volunteers joined the British Army. 50,000 lost their lives. Easter 1916 saw bitter divisions among the Irish volunteers and nationalists. 1,500 Republican rebels staged an Easter uprising against orders. After a week of fighting, the rebels surrendered and the leaders executed. Initial nationalist condemnation of the rebellion turned to sympathy. By 1919, Sinn Féin won 73 seats but refused to sit in the London Parliament. 1919 to 1921, the Independent Republican Army fought the British Army and parliamentary police called Black and Tans. The British solution to safeguard Unionists was to partition Ireland, 26 Catholic counties and 6 Unionist counties in Ulster, each semi-autonomous regions. The Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921, led by Michael Collins, established the Irish Free State, which was resisted by Republican Eamon de Valera. A bloody civil war resulted, ending in 1923. Michael Collins was ambushed and shot dead in 1922, and De Valera, later leader of Fianna Fáil, went on to duel with Winston Churchill during World War II, 1939, of which the Free State was officially neutral. The Free State was named Ireland in 1937, but officially declared a republic in 1949. Post-World War II recovery across Europe, Ireland enjoyed relative political stability. However, economic growth and investment was stagnant. Emigration in the 1950s rose to 16%, over 500,000 of a 3 million population. Unrest in Northern Ireland between the nationalists and loyalists raised its head after Catholic civil rights movement highlighted discrimination in the housing and job market. This escalated to riots and later sectarian violence. Gunfire and bombs killed many on both sides. The British Army based troops in Northern Ireland to restore order, only to further antagonise the IRA, who extended their campaign to the UK, bombing targets in London, Birmingham and Brighton. Over 3,000 lives were lost during the Troubles, until a ceasefire and peace process was signed in 1998. 2020. Is Ireland in safe times? No. Now the Irish are complicit by electing politicians plotting to destroy Ireland's sovereignty and replace its people. The new millennium economic boom led to massive personal debt, tax avoidance, globalist tech companies concreted over Dublin, and use of migrant cheap labour causing rapid house inflation unattainable to the ethnic Irish. 50,000 Irish graduates and skilled labour are emigrating every year, while uncontrolled, illegal, non-EU migration under NGO management is stressing the health service, education and housing. This is population replacement by design. Taoiseach Leo Varadkar signed the UN Migration Pact for open borders. He states he is a European, legislated for abortion and LGBTQ+ rights. He sells off oil drilling rights to China, approves explicit child sex education and compulsory vaccinations, sells the UN Agenda 21 to 40 dictate. He imposes artificial CO2 emission targets in one of Europe's cleanest countries. All this, and he was not elected by the Irish. Sinn Féin, facilitating the new Irish immigration, has been exposed as a Zionist communist party. Irish institutions and media under scrutiny for major corruption. What do Irish historians have to say about the genocide of the Irish? Let's start at the bottom. Journalist and historian Ruth Dudley Edwards. It's time to get over the fact that the Great Famine was not genocide. When it comes to our past, we should ignore nationalist myths and follow the evidence. The British government handled the catastrophe incompetently, but there was no deliberate cruelty and no intention to kill anyone. What caused the famine was the potato blight, not the English government. Get over it. No, Ruth, I'll never get over it. Who is Ruth Dudley Edwards? While addressing Wolston College, Cambridge, she sarcastically described the Irish as necrophiliac, very keen on the dead, especially if they are executed by the Brits. She mocks the proclamation and the Irish. Retired Professor Liam Kennedy resorts to cheap insults reviewing Tim Pat Coogan's book as providing junk food for the wilder reaches of America. Tim Pat was forthright in exposing the history truth cover-up by Irish historians. Kennedy insisted that genocide must be intentional. The go-to Irish historian for the Great Starvation is Professor Christine Keneally. Every exposed lie or truth withheld forces her next publication to offer a truth, but with a twist of lemon. It was the rich Irish that stole from the poor Irish. Christine worked hard to serve the Marxist education agenda of ethnic diversity in Ireland and unearthed Frederick Douglass, a black American slave who stayed in Ireland just for 4 months in 1845 to 46, publicising his autobiography. A 9-foot bronze statue was cast in 2013 to commemorate President Obama's visit to Ireland, costing $200,000. It features the hand of Obama, who has the blood of many thousands on it. What did Douglas do for the enslaved and hungry Irish? Nothing. I conclude part 2 here, but plead with interested Irish descendants across the world to engage with your ancestors and contribute to our story. Reject materialism, hedonism, and toxic weapons. All you need for life is food, water and fuel, and sea air. I pray one day you will come back home and embrace your God-given inheritance. Era. Thank you.
Jerry.